As the Galactic fleet descended, Earth's skies were pierced by the low hum of their massive ships, towering and gleaming. Each vessel stretched across miles of atmosphere, blocking out the sun and casting entire cities into shadows. News channels across the globe carried the same eerie message: surrender to the Galactic Empire. Resistance is futile. You will be incorporated into our collective for the greater good. The message was broadcast in dozens of languages, but no one needed a translation. The calm, authoritative tone of the alien envoy was unmistakable, a cold promise of inevitable conquest. People stood frozen in their homes, watching as the world they knew was suddenly upended. Earth had been invaded. For those who weren't paralyzed by fear, the first impulse was to run. Sirens screamed through the streets, and people flooded highways in mass exoduses toward unknown destinations. The governments of the world scrambled to respond. Military bases went into lockdown, and emergency measures were enacted as Earth's leaders debated their options in hurried, chaotic meetings. The prospect of an overwhelming alien force left little room for optimism. Most of the world's political leaders advised surrender. But in the midst of the panic, a different kind of resistance was already quietly forming. Commander Sarah Thompson was in the middle of a routine training exercise at a National Guard base in New Mexico when the broadcast went out. At first, she didn't believe it. The military had prepared for countless scenarios: alien attacks, global pandemics, nuclear fallout. But this, a peaceful, voluntary surrender to an unknown empire, it didn't add up. She immediately mobilized her team and demanded answers from higher-ups. "We're not surrendering," Sarah declared when she was told to stand down. "I've been in this business long enough to know that you don't let the enemy dictate terms without a fight." Her commanding officer looked at her with cold, pragmatic eyes. "Do you want to get yourself killed, Commander?" "No, sir. I want to stop us from getting all killed." Her words spread like wildfire. Across the country, small pockets of resistance sprang up as soldiers, civilians, and anyone with a weapon formed local militias. They weren't equipped with the shiny, futuristic weapons the Galactic wielded, just old rifles, shotguns, and a lot of homemade explosives. But they had something the invaders didn't account for: a fierce refusal to bend the knee. In New York, a group of survivalists led by a former police officer, John O'Connor, began organizing people to defend their neighborhoods. Armed with little more than their knowledge of the city's layout and a few decades-old firearms, they started attacking alien patrols from the shadows, using guerrilla tactics to slow the Galactic advance. In Chicago, tech geeks and engineers scrambled to rig old communication systems to send out encrypted messages to other cities, warning them of the threat. But it was in the heart of Los Angeles, where a former Navy SEAL named Marcus Turner coordinated with local militias, that the first major blow was struck. Marcus had fought in wars where the enemy had superior technology, but he knew how to adapt. The humans' old-world tactics were beginning to make the invaders nervous. Despite the odds, despite the power disparity, humans had one thing the Galactic hadn't anticipated: their will to survive. And as each minute passed, that will grew stronger. Back at her base, Sarah Thompson looked at the screen showing the Galactic fleet hovering over Earth and tightened her grip on the radio. "This isn't over yet. We fight." The Galactic were stunned. They had seen the humans' initial attempts at resistance, and to their amusement, they dismissed them as little more than chaotic skirmishes. After all, what could a few hundred old-fashioned rifles and hand grenades possibly accomplish against their advanced technology? Their war machines were designed to crush civilizations, and they were not used to being challenged by primitive weapons. The Galactic had encountered species across the galaxy that, when faced with overwhelming force, bowed their heads in submission. Humanity, it seemed, was different. Captain Lirac, a sharp-eyed officer in the Galactic military, was tasked with assessing the situation firsthand. With a quiet air of confidence, he led a team of elite scouts into the heart of one of Earth's major resistance zones, an area of New Jersey where a large faction of insurgents had gathered. "I'm certain this is nothing we can't handle," Ulrak remarked to his aide as they hovered over the dense urban sprawl in a sleek assault shuttle. From their vantage point, the landscape looked like any other human city, no different from the countless others they'd conquered across the stars. Yet below, the humans were unlike any species Ulrak had encountered. As their shuttle descended toward a hidden resistance camp on the outskirts of a destroyed industrial park, Lurak's team expected to find little more than unorganized civilians armed with whatever they could scrounge. But when they landed and disembarked, they were greeted by a far more organized and well-prepared group than they had imagined. The humans were already waiting for them. Using guerrilla tactics, they'd set up traps throughout the ruins, using nothing more than old-world technology like tripwires and explosives. The Galactor soldiers, with their advanced kinetic shields and enhanced reflexes, expected to see their technology laugh off any human assault. But the moment the first blast detonated, Lurak's team was rocked. The explosion, far larger than anything they had anticipated, sent them stumbling backward, throwing their precision targeting off. The humans had adapted the old C4 explosives in ways that created far more force than the Galactor had thought possible from such a rudimentary material. "Impossible," Lurak muttered, his thoughts swirling. The humans' weaponry wasn't just primitive, it was brutally effective in ways that his advanced military didn't account for. They had designed a trap, using their city's infrastructure against him. Through old urban blueprints and knowledge of the land, they had turned their environment into a lethal weapon. Even more surprising were the humans' strategic instincts. They didn't fight like a conventional army. They fought like individuals, every one of them a moving piece in an unpredictable chess game. Some of Lurak's soldiers attempted to chase down the insurgents, but the humans disappeared into the rubble, only to reappear elsewhere, sniping from hidden windows or launching attacks from unexpected angles. It was a battle of attrition, and Lurak soon realized that this wasn't a war of technology, it was a war of will. He surveyed the damage, burnt-out hovercrafts, and scattered remnants of Galactor machinery. "Report," he ordered coldly, but the faces of his soldiers told the tale before anyone spoke. "They're using our own strengths against us," one of his lieutenants said quietly. Lurak turned toward the horizon, the smoke from the battle billowing up into the sky. "They're not the weaklings we assumed." His voice was tight with frustration. "Prepare for a harder fight. The humans are far more dangerous than we thought." This would not be the easy conquest they had envisioned. And soon, every Galactor commander would learn that lesson the hard way. The Galactor responded to their growing frustration with increased force, launching an all-out assault on one of Earth's most strategic cities, Houston, Texas. The city was home to key military installations and vital infrastructure. The Galactor were certain that if they could cripple Houston, humanity's ability to resist would crumble. They unleashed an overwhelming wave of advanced biosoldiers, massive, hulking creatures clad in reinforced armor, with plasma rifles built into their arms. Accompanying them were drone swarms capable of wiping out entire neighborhoods in seconds. In the early hours of the attack, the streets of Houston were transformed into a battleground. Buildings crumbled under the weight of laser fire. Skyscrapers exploded as the Galactor's orbital bombardment shattered the skyline. For the humans caught in the chaos, panic spread like wildfire. But among the shattered streets and burning rubble, something else was growing. Resistance. The human response, led by Marcus Turner, a former Navy SEAL turned civilian fighter, was swift and calculated. Marcus had seen his fair share of urban warfare, and he knew that Houston, with its sprawling layout and dense neighborhoods, was a nightmare for anyone trying to conquer it from the outside. The Galactor had underestimated how well the humans could use their environment to their advantage. While the biosoldiers were strong, they weren't built for fighting in tight urban spaces. That's where Marcus and his team of resistance fighters thrived. "We don't have fancy weapons," Marcus said to his ragtag crew as they gathered in a makeshift headquarters deep in the underground metro tunnels. "But we've got one thing they don't: the city itself. We'll hit them hard and fast, then disappear before they can retaliate. Keep moving. Keep them guessing. And above all, stay unpredictable. The Resistance set up their first trap in the heart of downtown. Using old-school landmines and scrap metal, they rigged a major intersection with a series of explosive charges. As a Galactor platoon approached, their heavy armored boots pounding the pavement, a signal from one of Marcus's scouts triggered the first detonation. The explosion tore apart the lid bio-soldier, sending pieces of metal and alien flesh flying into the air. The Galactor squad was thrown into disarray. The Resistance fighters, armed with whatever they could scrounge, rifles, shotguns, even hunting crossbows, rained fire down on the confused invaders from balconies and rooftop hideouts. The Galactor quickly regrouped, calling in reinforcements, but the humans were already gone, vanishing into the labyrinth of alleys and abandoned buildings. For every one of their soldiers the Galactor hunted down, 2 more of their own went down in surprise ambushes. They were learning quickly that the humans were anything but helpless. In the close quarters of urban warfare, the alien technology that had once seemed invincible was suddenly a liability. Despite the technological disparity, the Galactor could not break the Resistance. Every time they thought they'd cornered a group of fighters, a truck rigged with explosives would detonate, or a building would collapse in on them, set off by carefully planted charges. For the first time in weeks, the Galactor began to doubt the inevitability of their victory. The Battle of Houston was no longer just about taking the city. It was a test of their entire strategy. In the middle of the destruction, as the sound of gunfire and explosions echoed through the city, Marcus Turner received word that the Galactor had deployed their orbital laser cannons, aiming to obliterate the heart of the Resistance. He knew time was running out. He turned to his team, determination hardening his expression. "We've bought ourselves a little time," he said, "but we need to hit them hard. Now, if we can take out their command center, we might just stop this madness before it gets worse." With that, the fight in Houston took on a new intensity, and the Resistance's tactics grew more daring. They were no longer running. They were pushing back. As the battle raged on in Houston, Supreme Commander Viran sat in the war room aboard the Turcan, the flagship of the Galactor fleet. The planet below was a swirling chaos of destruction. Yet something felt wrong. The humans, the very species they had deemed primitive and easily subdued, were proving far more resilient than expected. It was a fact that gnawed at Viran with every passing moment. He had expected to find easy prey on Earth, a species barely capable of interplanetary travel, using technology that seemed stuck in an ancient era. But instead, they were adapting faster than his forces could respond. The ambush in New Jersey, the traps in Houston, the sabotage in Central Park, all of it was unexpected. Even now, as his fleet pounded the Earth's surface with orbital bombardments, the humans were refusing to break. "Commander, we are receiving another transmission from Earth," his communications officer reported, voice tense. "They are coordinating resistance movements globally. It seems they are learning faster than we anticipated." Viran's clawed hand tightened around the armrest of his command chair. He had already given orders to escalate the bombardment, but it was clear now that his initial assumptions were dangerously wrong. He thought the humans would cower, beg for mercy. Instead, they were becoming more resourceful by the day, using their environment, their old technologies, and most dangerously, their unpredictability to strike back. How could this be? "Send in Captain Lurak," Viran barked. "I want a full report on the ground. I want to know what we're up against." Moments later, Captain Lurak, the seasoned Galactor officer, appeared on the holographic screen. His face was etched with frustration and barely contained anger. "We've underestimated them, Commander. The humans, they're not what we thought. Their tactics, they've adapted quickly to our weapons, turned their own territory into a weapon against us. It's like they want to fight. Their will to resist is relentless." Viran narrowed his eyes, staring through the holographic display at Lurak's report of the ongoing engagements. The bio-soldiers, so lethal on other worlds, had been ambushed again and again by human guerrilla fighters. What truly perplexed Varan, though, was the sheer ingenuity of the humans. Captain Lorak had recounted how a single civilian programmer, Laura Simmons, had hacked a Galactor war machine, a raider unit, and turned it on its own creators, using nothing more than an outdated laptop and some basic knowledge of human tech. They are fighting with what they have, Elrak continued, his voice tinged with disbelief. Their weapons are old. Their tech is outdated, but they've learned how to make it work in ways we never thought possible. They don't need the firepower we have. They use what's around them. Varan's jaw tightened. His gaze flicked to a display showing the damaged bio-soldiers and destroyed drones. His forces were losing, slowly but steadily. The humans were relentless, taking out key command posts, sneaking behind enemy lines, exploiting every weakness. We need to adjust our strategy, Varan said, voice cold but thoughtful. Continue the bombardment, but increase our ground forces. Deploy the full might of the fleet. If we do not crush them now, they will be the ones who destroy us. Lorak nodded reluctantly, understanding the shift in Varan's tone. The Galactor had always believed their advanced technology would guarantee their victory, but the humans were showing that technological superiority was no match for sheer human willpower. It was an unsettling realization, one that would cost the Galactor dearly. We'll adapt, Commander, Lorak said, his voice carrying the weight of grim determination. But this will not be over quickly. The humans, if we do not destroy them now, will learn to fight back harder. Varan turned away from the display, his eyes narrowing. We will not lose to them. He turned back to the communication officer. Send the orders. Full-scale invasion. Leave nothing standing. But deep within, a part of Varan couldn't shake the creeping doubt. Could they really win this war? Or had the Galactor underestimated humanity's true strength? With each passing day, the Galactor invasion grew more brutal, but so did the human resistance. Despite the overwhelming odds, the humans refused to bend the knee. They had learned, adapted, and most dangerously for the invaders, begun to fight on their own terms. Back in Houston, Marcus Turner and his team had struck a decisive blow. They had managed to sabotage a critical Galactor command center in the heart of the city, using a combination of explosives, hack technology, and sheer ingenuity. But as they celebrated their small victory, the aliens responded with even more devastating force. The orbital bombardments intensified, and the Galactor began deploying specialized shock troops, superior to their regular bio-soldiers. These new units were designed specifically for urban combat, with reinforced armor and energy weapons capable of melting through concrete walls. The situation looked increasingly grim. But amid this growing despair, a breakthrough occurred. Dr. James Reynolds, a physicist and former defense contractor, had been working in secret, attempting to unravel the Galactor's energy weaponry. The invaders' main weapon systems were powered by a rare and volatile mineral known as zintherite, which had an unusual property. When exposed to sudden, massive amounts of electromagnetic energy, it became highly unstable. Dr. Reynolds had theorized that the Galactor's energy-based weapons were vulnerable to a feedback loop caused by zintherite's reaction to certain human technologies, specifically old nuclear warheads. At first, the idea seemed ludicrous. The humans had no access to advanced alien tech, and their own military capabilities were outdated. But Reynolds, along with a small group of engineers, scoured old military sites across the country, recovering obsolete nuclear warheads, relics from the Cold War era. After weeks of work, they managed to create a crude, yet effective, countermeasure. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would rig the warheads with a series of makeshift electromagnetic pulses designed to trigger the zintherite's volatile instability. The bombs were crude, yes, but if they could get them close enough to the Galactor's energy sources, they might just be able to turn the tide. Reynolds, now working with a team of guerrilla fighters and military veterans, coordinated with Marcus Turner's group. They would have one shot, and the stakes were higher than ever. If the operation failed, it could mean the end of any hope for Earth's survival. "Get to the reactor core," Reynolds instructed Marcus over the comms. "Once the EMP charges are in place, the chain reaction will destabilize the Zintherite in their power grid. You'll have 30 seconds before it detonates. Move fast, and don't stop until you're out of there." It was an all-or-nothing mission, but Marcus wasn't one to back down. "Understood," he said, his voice steady. "We're on our way." As Marcus and his team infiltrated the heavily guarded Galactor facility, their every move was a gamble. The aliens had no idea that human ingenuity had found their weakness. The plan was risky, but it was their best, and perhaps only, chance. As the team planted the EMP devices near the reactor, Marcus felt a pang of hope, a hope that had been absent for weeks. Perhaps, just perhaps, they had found a way to break the Galactor's stranglehold on Earth. With the final charge set, Marcus gave the signal. "We're done. Get clear now." The team sprinted through the narrow corridors, the sound of their footsteps pounding against the metal floor. Behind them, the Galactor reactor hummed ominously, completely unaware of the impending destruction. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in the war, the humans had a real chance to win. As Marcus Turner and his team sprinted down the winding corridors of the Galactor reactor facility, their hearts pounded in unison with the ticking clock. The EMP devices had been planted, but they weren't out of danger yet. The facility was crawling with Galactor soldiers, their hulking forms moving swiftly through the halls, their advanced sensors scanning for any signs of intrusion. "Move! Move!" Marcus barked, pushing his squad forward. His pulse raced as they rounded a corner, barely avoiding a patrol of bio-soldiers. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the weight of imminent danger. Every second they spent in the facility raised the chances that the Galactor would realize what was happening, and by then, it would be too late for escape. Meanwhile, back at the makeshift Resistance Command Center in Houston, Dr. James Reynolds stared at the flickering monitor with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. He had no eyes on the ground, no real-time data from the field. All he had was his faith in Marcus and his team. They had planted the charges, but the next step was crucial. If the EMP devices did what they were designed to do, it would trigger a chain reaction in the Zintherite power core, destabilizing the entire Galactor energy grid. That would cripple the alien fleet's most advanced weaponry, potentially leveling the playing field for the humans. But there was no telling how long it would take for the blast to trigger, or how much damage the Galactor would inflict in the meantime. 30 seconds, Reynolds muttered to himself, watching the countdown timer tick away in real time. Back in the reactor core, Marcus led his team toward the exit, their bodies moving like shadows through the vast metallic hallways. The hum of the Galactor machinery filled their ears as they approached the main doors. With a final burst of speed, Marcus reached the control panel and swiped his hand across the cracked surface. His fingers, slick with sweat, hovered over the activation button. 10 seconds, he grunted into his comms. The signal was faint, crackling with static as the interference from the facility's energy fields grew more intense. "We need to move now." With one final glance at the massive reactor, he slammed his palm against the activation panel. Outside, across the city, the resistance fighters had already begun to evacuate their safe houses. The moment the EMP devices went off, the chaos would be deafening, both in the facility and in the skies above Houston. The Galactor were expecting a steady, controlled siege. Instead, they were about to face a catastrophic failure of their entire technological infrastructure. "Now," Reynolds shouted as he watched the countdown hit 0 on his terminal. The facility shook violently as the EMP charges discharged their deadly energy into the core. A pulse of white-hot light radiated from the heart of the reactor, followed by a deep rumble that rattled the ground. The very air seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the detonation. For a moment, everything stopped. The hum of the Galactor's advanced tech cut off, and a wave of silence swept over the facility. Then, as the pulse continued to spread, the lights flickered, and the unmistakable sound of machinery failing to function filled the air. Within seconds, the Zintherite core destabilized. Explosions began to ripple through the facility, each one sending a shockwave that rattled the very foundation of the Galactor complex. Marcus and his team barely made it to the exit before the entire complex erupted in a series of violent explosions. As they sprinted toward the underground tunnels, they could hear the facility collapsing behind them. The Zintherite explosion had triggered a chain reaction, and the once mighty reactor was now attuned for the alien invaders. "We did it," one of Marcus's squad members shouted breathlessly. But their victory was short-lived as the ground beneath them shook again. "Keep moving," Marcus ordered. The battle for Houston, and for Earth, was far from over. The Galactor fleet had suffered a devastating blow, but they would not give up easily. Now it was up to the humans to capitalize on this new opening and push the aliens back once and for all. The explosion at the Galactor reactor was the turning point. A seismic shockwave reverberated across the entire city of Houston, sending dust and debris into the air, as buildings groaned and collapsed under the force of the detonation. The Zintherite core had been destabilized, and with it, the Galactor's most powerful weaponry faltered. Their fleet was crippled, and the bio-soldiers on the ground were thrown into disarray, their command systems failing. For the first time since the invasion began, the Galactor were on the back foot. "Marcus, we need to move now." Dr. Reynolds' voice crackled through the comms. "The window is closing. The Galactor will regroup quickly. You have less than an hour before they bring in their full force again." Marcus Turner didn't need to hear that twice. He had already seen the destruction firsthand and knew this was their best, and only, chance to turn the tide. The clock was ticking, and they needed to hit hard before the aliens could adapt. He motioned to his team. "We hit their remaining command posts. We stopped them from regrouping. Full assault." Marcus and his squad, along with several other resistance units, moved swiftly through the decimated city. The streets were a war zone, burning vehicles, shattered glass, and the twisted wreckage of Galactor drones littering the area. But the humans, now emboldened by their victory, moved with purpose. Their tactical advantage was clear. The Galactor were reeling from the loss of their energy infrastructure, and their communication systems were in chaos. This was a window of opportunity. "We've got a convoy of Galactor reinforcements coming in from the east," one of Marcus's scouts reported. "They're trying to push through to regain control of the city's southern sector." Marcus frowned. He knew this would be their final, desperate push. If the resistance could sever the Galactor's command and communications, it would cripple their ability to organize a counterattack. But the risk was enormous. The alien forces were regrouping with terrifying speed, and the Galactor fleet still hovered in orbit, ready to bring down overwhelming firepower if needed. "We'll need to hit them hard and fast," Marcus said. "Once we're in, there's no turning back. The moment we hit the convoy, the entire sector will light up. They'll know we're coming." As the resistance fighters positioned themselves along the eastern sector, Marcus felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was their chance to finish what they had started. He gave the signal, and the attack began. The first wave hit the Galactor convoy with surgical precision. Homemade explosives and guerrilla tactics brought the alien reinforcements to a screeching halt. The convoy was caught off guard. Marcus's team, backed by heavily armed volunteers and militia forces, laid down suppressive fire as they advanced toward the Galactor's command vehicles. But the Galactor quickly regrouped. Their bio-soldiers, more powerful and heavily armed than their regular troops, fanned out, taking cover behind wrecked vehicles and launching counterattacks. The resistance fighters fought tooth and nail, using every scrap of ammunition they had left, launching guerrilla strikes and taking down alien soldiers in ambush after ambush. The humans were outgunned, but their desperation made them relentless. "We've got them on the ropes," one of the fighters yelled. "Keep pushing." The sound of plasma fire and explosions echoed through the streets as both sides clashed in brutal urban combat. But Marcus wasn't focused on the chaos around him. He was focused on the next target, the Galactor command vehicle at the center of the convoy. With a group of his best fighters, Marcus moved forward, dodging energy blasts and returning fire with precision. As they reached the command vehicle, he placed a final explosive charge near its base. "On my mark, we take them down. One shot. One kill." The charge detonated, sending a blast of fire through the vehicle. The alien commander inside was incinerated in a split second, and with that, the heart of their remaining leadership was shattered. But the victory came at a cost. Marcus watched as several of his team members fell under enemy fire. The resistance had struck a blow, but they had also paid a heavy price. "This isn't over yet," Marcus muttered, watching the smoke rise from the wreckage of the Galactor command center. The aliens were still a formidable force. But for the first time in weeks, he saw the faintest glimmer of hope. They had proven that Earth would not fall without a fight. And that fight was far from finished. The final battle had begun. The Galactor, battered and broken, were far from defeated. Their fleet still hovered in Earth's orbit, a constant threat of destruction looming over the planet. The once invincible alien force, however, now found itself in a desperate scramble. The humans had shattered their leadership and crippled their technology. For the first time in the invasion, the Galactor were reacting, not acting. Back on the ground in Houston, Marcus Turner stood atop a ruined skyscraper, watching the chaos below. The streets were strewn with the remnants of battle, burnt-out vehicles, collapsed buildings, and scattered alien corpses. His team, though worn and bloodied, had pushed through the city's eastern sector and wiped out the remaining command centers. But the fight wasn't over. It couldn't be. The Galactor had already begun regrouping. If they didn't act now, they would rebuild their strength and crush what was left of the resistance. "We've bought ourselves a day at most," Marcus muttered, his eyes scanning the wreckage. Dr. Reynolds, who had joined the remaining commanders in the field, approached from behind. His eyes were tired, but there was a spark in them. "The Galactor fleet is destabilized. Their advanced weapons are offline. Their remaining forces are fractured. If we can capitalize on this, we might finally have a chance." Marcus nodded grimly. "But they won't just sit back and wait for us to regroup. If they can't control the ground, they'll burn everything from above. We've got one shot to hit them where it hurts, their command ship. If we can disable it, we can force a retreat." A plan was quickly formed, one that involved using the Resistance's remaining strength, scattered throughout the city, to launch a final strike against the Galactor flagship, Turkan. The ship was the nerve center of their entire operation, and without it, the Galactor would have no ability to coordinate their forces. But getting to it wouldn't be easy. The flagship was surrounded by layers of defenses and guarded by elite Galactor soldiers. "What about the orbital weapons?" asked Commander Laura Simmons, the civilian hacker who had helped turn the tide earlier by sabotaging Galactor war machines. "We could use their own weapons against them." Dr. Reynolds looked up at the night sky, his face set in determination. "I've been working on something. A way to hack their remaining orbital cannons. If I can access the satellite relay, we might be able to override their targeting systems. But it's a long shot." "We don't have time for long shots," Marcus said, eyes narrowing. "We take the Turkan down, or we lose everything." With a nod, the Resistance began their final assault. A small, elite group led by Marcus infiltrated the Galactor command ship's defenses, using the crumbling city's wreckage as cover. Meanwhile, Laura, alongside Dr. Reynolds, and a team of hackers, worked their way to an old communications relay tower, the key to accessing the Galactor's orbital network. The Galactor fought back with a ferocity that made the ground tremble, but the humans were relentless. Every building they passed, every barricade they breached, brought them closer to their goal. Finally, after hours of fierce urban combat, Marcus and his team reached the core of the flagship's defense grid, while Reynolds' team took control of the relay tower. With one final push, Reynolds managed to send a surge of feedback into the Galactor's orbital systems. The alien fleet's powerful weapons, once poised to obliterate the Earth, now turned against their masters. A series of explosions erupted across the sky as their own cannons backfired, taking out large portions of the fleet. The Turken, caught off guard and vulnerable, shuddered violently as it began to lose power. The remaining Galactor troops, now scrambling to regain control, were too late. The humans' final strike had succeeded. The Turken plummeted, flaming and broken, to the Earth below. As the ship crashed, the remaining Galactor forces, now leaderless and shattered, began to retreat, their pride and their plans in ruins. The Resistance, though battered, had won. Marcus stood amidst the wreckage, staring at the burning remnants of the alien ship. It was done. The invaders had been driven from Earth. The planet had survived, but at a great cost. The human race had proven its resilience, and that, no matter how advanced the enemy, there was one thing the Galactor had never accounted for: the spirit of humanity. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the surviving Resistance fighters looked out over the ruined city. Earth was free once again, but the road to recovery would be long. Still, for the first time in months, hope was in the air, and humanity would rebuild.